Good evening, everyone. I want to thank you for tuning into the Zoom. This evening, I would like to talk to you about victims of rape. I want to start with first going over what is defined as rape. Rape is anything that occurs as far as sexual intercourse that takes place on a non-consensual basis, meaning it's not agreed upon. Rape can occur when a person forces another to engage in any sexual activities against their will. In today's society, it is common for women, men, and children to all be at risk of getting raped. There are different types of rape: diminished capacity rape, age-related rape, incest, partner and marital rape, date rape, acquaintance rape, aggravated rape, and gang rape, along with or in conjunction with hate crime. Those can all be different types of rape. I want to take a closer look at date rape specifically. The term date rape refers to rape committed by a person who has had some sort of romantic relationship or was on a date or had a past sexual relationship with the victim. Date rape is most rampant among college and high school students, and the frequent overuse of alcohol and other drugs creates a large pool of people that can be taken advantage of. A lot of times this can be a bar or at a party. I want to give you two quick examples of different types of date rape. The first would be, say Jane Doe meets John Deere at a party. Everyone's drinking, they're having a good time. John is making sure John is making sure that Jane is close by, has a refill with her, in her glass at all times. She's drinking, he's telling her to drink up, he's encouraging her to continue drinking. Eventually she's obviously now drunk, stumbling. So he helps her into his car, takes her to his apartment, and then helps her up the steps. Once inside, John and Jane do end up having sex, and they go to bed. Jane wakes up, she's confused, she's humiliated. She ends up making a police report. She does not feel like she consented. She does not feel like what happened was okay. John, he gets angry, he's upset. Why would she do that? He didn't force her to have sex. But the fact is, Jane wasn't legally able to give consent. She was under the influence of alcohol, and that was obvious because John had to help her both to his car and then into the apartment. So John is guilty. He commit rape. It's not violent, but it's a felony crime. I believe it is felony violent crime. Even though he didn't necessarily force her, it's still the fact that the consent was not there. The next example would be Jane Doe is out with her friends at a bar. Everyone's having a good time. John Deere doesn't know her, walks up with a drink to introduce himself, kind of a sign of goodwill. What Jane doesn't know is he's already slipped GHB into the drink before he gave it to her. So she drinks it. Not too long after, she finds herself kind of dizzy. She's stumbling. She's blacking in and out. Her friends, they're dancing. They're having a good time. So they're not paying attention to the fact that Jane is getting let out of the bar with John. He's helping her to his car. She is friendly enough to him, but she's also obviously under the influence of this drug. He brings her to the apartment. He ends up having sex with her. She is in and out of consciousness. So the next day she wakes up and she's confused about where she is, who she's with, what happened. She's got some missed calls from her friends, but she doesn't tell them what happened. She's humiliated. She's not sure if she was to blame for that encounter. So Jane doesn't tell anyone. She leaves and she feels she's not a victim. So Jane does not report this. Basically, there's no repercussion. John is absolutely just as guilty, but he will get away with that because of Jane's fear of coming forward, even though he drugged her. So those are two examples I want to just kind of have you know and think about when we go over these date rape drugs. Most commonly used, alcohol, number one. Other date rape drugs that are often referred to as the club drugs, one being is gamma hydroxybutyrate, and that's what we refer to as GHB. There's Rofinol, and then any benzodiazepine such as Xanax or Klonopin can be used. Any of those drugs when used in conjunction with alcohol, so if somebody's already drinking and they may not know, or if it's used with a drink, the effects can be more severe. Reason these things are called club drugs is they're most popular used at clubs, parties, concerts, any of the venues where a lot of people are gathering. And these drugs are used on both men and women. A specific case that I was studying with date rape was the case of Andrew Luster. And I think his is a really important one to look at because he was the heir to a huge cosmetic empire. So he was kind of the trust fund kid in Malibu, California. He lived on the beach. He had a lavish lifestyle. He partied a lot, always out, handsome young man. He was living the life until he ended up being accused of a series of rapes. 3 women came forward. One was 17, one was 21, and the third he actually was having a relationship with, but she accused him of giving her GHB. All 3 of these women came forward and said that they were raped while they were unconscious, that Luster had used GHB, drugged them, and then with some of them even videotaped. The police ended up going and searching Luster's home. They found GHB vials. They found other recreational drugs. They found a lot of the videotapes of these poor women. They went back as far as 1991. He had raped dozens of women, all in different states: California, Arizona, even Mexico. So prosecutors obviously requested a high bail for this Luster guy. He's a minimum of $10,000. They eventually went up to $1 million as more and more people came forward. He had been accused of threatening to kill his victims. He was definitely a flight risk in the eyes of the law. So they did set the bail at $1 million, but that was easy for him to get. He had access to his family's fortune, and he did flee the country. He ended up taking off to Mexico. The judge continued his trial. He got convicted of guilty of 86 of the 87 counts against him, which is, that in itself is really impressive. A lot of times these people get convicted, they get the charges brought forward, but they're not convicted. He had 20 counts of drug-induced rape, 17 counts of raping an unconscious victim, multiple counts of committing other sexual acts by use of drugs. He was sentenced to serve 6 years for each of those 20 counts of rape, and he was supposed to serve them consecutively, which means that each sentence must be completed before the next begins. That's great for his victims. A lot of times it's concurrent, which means that they just go at the same time he would have got out earlier. He eventually did get tracked down by Dog the Bounty Hunter, which a lot of people know from his TV show, and he was returned to the U.S. to serve a sentence. So, that's one case where these victims got some peace of mind and a little closure when he actually was convicted and then brought back to serve his time. I'm going to include a little media clip just going over that case with some of the more minute details. But with Andrew Luster, he is one example of where the law brings us justice. But in general, what the data tells us is that the data doesn't tell us a lot. Since 2016, the U.S. is reporting that rape cases are seeming to decrease, which you would think wonderful. However, a lack of reports means that doesn't mean that that's actual lack of rapes. It's really the lack of reports. Victims that don't have the strength or courage to come forward are, unfortunately, that's where the crime goes unpunished, and they're not counted among these statistics. So in 2017, there were 136,000 rapes reported in total, but even that number, although being higher than 2018, decreasing, we don't know if all of those had actually been reported. Just a statistic that kind of stuck out with me I wanted to include was, in 2019, Texas had the highest number of rapes in the U.S. at 14,824 cases, whereas Vermont reported the fewest at 278. So just kind of showing you where the states vary. But back to how that number doesn't reflect the actual crime. So we call it the dark figure of crime, which criminal justice majors will recognize. It's basically a term given to the number of unreported or undiscovered crimes. Rape and sexual assault are 2 of the most underreported crimes in the U.S. So we know right there the UCR is not a reliable indicator of sexual assaults. And that means that the statistics that we see, we can right off the bat consider them pretty inaccurate. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, at least, and again that's at least, 65% of rapes and sexual assaults never get reported and never are brought to the attention of the police. When asked, when these victims are asked why not report, typically the leading reason is that they don't consider it, that they consider it a personal matter and they deal with it in another way. So they are not thinking that it's something the law needs to deal with, and that's really sad. I included a special report from back in August 2012 that was really sad to look at as far as statistics, and then why these victims don't report. It kind of goes into detail a little more where the UCR is kind of failing us. For the victims that don't report because they're afraid, I wanted to include a little media clip. It's really great. It's about the football coach that was raped by Jerry Sandusky. He was the first young man to come forward and really get that investigation rolling. This football coach had sexually assaulted, dozens over his years as coach and both as an assistant coach to the school. So he had access. He had these kids. He had teachers who would go pick up the kids, bring them to his house. Just really sad to see how deep his web went. But this young man went forward, told the principal what was happening to him, and the principal looked at him and his mom and said, "Why don't you go home and think about it?" He was basically told, "Forget about it," or "We don't believe you." And it really highlights why you can see a victim would be afraid to come forward, that they're afraid no one's going to believe them when they do. So that ABC News exclusive is really great, as far as, not great in the sense it shows you how sad it is to be a victim of these assaults and have to deal with that. But luckily that young man had the courage to come forward, and eventually it led to his attacker facing trial. There's a lot of social stigma around rape and sexual assault that deters people from reporting the crimes. Often these crimes are inflicted by people in the victim's life, such as family members, acquaintances, partners. So when the offender is someone close to the victim, it's twice as hard to go to the police to report it, and that means twice as likely that the crime goes unreported. Victims really do fear not being believed or reprisal, or sometimes it's even getting the offender in trouble, even though they know what they're doing is wrong. Because of that bond they may have, or because of how close that person may be to them, they don't report. And that means that victims really do need the right supports in order to be able to fight for their justice and begin healing. Some things that we can all do to help victims of rape. I think sexual violence and sexual assault should be viewed as a community issue. That will help the victims come forward without the fear of not being believed, or being viewed poorly. I think that when victims do report the crime, they have to instantly get those right supports to help them through their traumatic experiences. Creating a safe environment is really the only way to ensure that victims will have the courage to continue to come forward and report these attacks. And also I think that the government should really make it as easy as possible for rape victims to seek justice. Law enforcement should be getting special training specific to supporting rape victims, as well as pursuing arrests against the attackers whenever possible, really making sure that they're doing their best job to investigate each specific report. And in national level, we have RAIN, which is a wonderful resource for rape victims. It's the National Sexual Assault Telephone Hotline. And when you call that hotline, you get access to a range of free services. It includes confidential support from trained members, finding local health facilities, getting a forensic exam, having someone help talk you through what's happened. It helps with legal resources, local resources, referrals for long-term support, and just even basic information about any medical questions or just questions in general about the attack. So that, I think, is a great resource for victims. I included a link for them. In New York State, we have the New York State Office of Victim Services, which is referred to as OVS. They're there to help in a number of ways for victims, their family members, close friends, anybody really who is a part of that victimization from a crime. So the OVS can provide both direct and indirect supports. They give education on the rights for the victim, and they help go over what those rights are, as well as point victims to other service providers who may be able to assist in each specific situation. So I included their link. And then here in Warren County, we have the Warren County Crisis Center, which is a wonderful resource for anyone who may be the victim of sexual assault or rape. We have the New York State Campus Consent Consortium. They're really trying to bring forth more education to college students and New York State campuses for high school, middle school, to kind of help prevent sexual assault and rape. And then we also, I just included a link for sexual assault victims' rights, and that's from the New York State Sexual Assault Association, and that kind of just details all of the rights that each victim has, which knowing your rights is so beneficial, just to maybe having a little sense of security when you start that process. So thank you all so much for tuning in, and I hope that this was informative. Thank you.